I'm a game designer. I've been a game designer for about 15 years. I've worked at big companies, small companies. I was working at Monolith, not just before they were shut down, but that's actually kind of what I want to talk about. Because one of the things that I heard when talking to people when Monolith was shut down was that they didn't really understand what we had built. And I kind of think a lot of people didn't understand what we had built. And it kind of touches to what is weird and interesting about procedural generation. I've been working on procedural generation for a long time, and it's tough. And what's really tough is keeping your players in mind, uh, kind of throughout that process. Let's see. Okay, cool. So I want to talk about the Nemesis system. How many of you guys have heard about that? Okay. I will tell you what it is, and I'll tell you how it was pitched to people. But it's kind of the feature that Shadow of Mordor, Shadow of War were kind of sold on. At the time it came out, Monolith was like, well, they were a big studio, but they were kind of a failing studio. They were about to be shut down. And if it wasn't for the Nemesis system, like Shadow of Mordor would have been a failure. Uh, this in general, I don't want to like lecture at you guys just totally. I want it to kind of be back and forth. So I'm going to stop, ask questions. And if anybody ever has a question, just let me know. Totally cool. Okay. So the first and most important thing is that nobody is doing this anymore. We shipped 2 games with it, and then we were like, okay, we're going to build it for the third game. We never built that third game, and then they canceled it and started a Wonder Woman game. They canceled that. Monolith itself could not build games using the system, and nobody else could either. At the time, I think part of it is that Monolith has kind of changed as a studio. When it started in like 1995. It was a shooter studio for a long time. Blood, No One Lives Forever, Fear. They were kind of a lot of that design was driven by one person, Craig Hubbard, and that's kind of the thing that can happen at a big studio. You'll find that there are key people who the whole thing kind of falls apart without it. Around 2005, when they're doing Fear, shooters were kind of changing. That's right after that is when Call of Duty Modern Warfare comes out. That's when single player campaigns kind of fall out of focus. Everybody shifts over to multiplayer. That kind of kills shooters, and that's when Monolith gets bought by Warner Brothers. Surreal also gets bought by Warner Brothers. They had done what had Surreal done? Surreal formed out of like Boss Games, some other Seattle studios. Snowblind was also around at that time. They did Baldur's Gate Dark Alliance. They did a bunch of those like dungeon crawly games, the EverQuest PS2 games. They were all wrapped into one studio, and Warner Brothers was kind of like, okay, guys, go without a direction because shooters weren't working. Open world games were in, but nobody was really making money on open world games, and it wasn't really clear what they were going to do. Shadow of Mordor started as a small, tiny project working on this idea, like building this Nemesis system. A bunch of people were working on a Batman game that was about to get canceled, and when that game finished, they all moved on to this project because it was so cool. Once this game hit, it was big, it kind of saved the studio. They started working on a sequel. The sequel did the sequel did okay. There were a lot of issues that we can talk about, and like we ate dirt for 3 months leading up to launch, and that really killed our momentum. But it was the thing where we thought we were going to be able to challenge like Assassin's Creed. And one of the things that I learned from sitting next to the creative director, he had like 30% of his brain was dedicated to sales figures. He always knew what the top 10 games of every year were. And so he'd be like, okay, look, it's always Call of Duty on top. There's always a Madden, there's always a FIFA. The biggest single player game is always Assassin's Creed. And so if we want to make something sustaining, we have to topple Assassin's Creed. So that was like our target for 4 years. And that's why Shadow of War, so Shadow of Mordor also came out the year of Assassin's Creed Unity. So that was the year that the Assassin's Creed was super buggy. It was considered a failure. And so that was also a super opportunity for us. So when this came out, they're like, what if we're bigger? What if we're better? Maybe this becomes the next Assassin's Creed. It doesn't happen. Um, And then, recently Ubisoft decided, well, we don't need to make Assassin's Creed games anymore, so we're not going to make any money either. So I, it's very strange, kind of what's going on with Ubisoft. Like they were shipping those games every 2 years or less, and then they just kind of stopped. And that's kind of something that we've seen with a lot of AAA stuff recently. As far as Monolith goes, after Shadow of War, after we're kind of recovering, after we're paying off our debts because we're making the DLC, because with a game this big, you ship, you sell the DLC beforehand, because that's when people are most excited about the game. They're like, I'm going to play so much of this game, and that's when, in order to sell the same number of copies at a game that costs 50% more than your last one, you have to sell at a higher price to everybody. So once the game comes out, we're stuck making DLC for 9 months, even though nobody new is buying it. But just kind of, you're just paying off people's expectations so that they trust you in the future. We moved on to do a new game that hasn't like been talked about yet. That was going to kind of go beyond all of the limitations that we had in Shadow of War. We worked on it for 3 years. Warner Brothers wasn't super happy with it ever, and they never said that they wanted to make the game, but they never said no. So after 3 years, they said, okay, maybe you should make a different game. And that kind of killed, that was like the second killing of the studio. Because at that point, everybody who'd been working on this, about half the studio left. It was like most of the senior people. And this is a case where there were people there who had been there since the 90s, like people who'd worked on Claw and Blood. And um, so when that happened, you kind of got a new monolith. There were like 100 people left, and they started work on a Wonder Woman game. And the pitch was very simple. It's like, we're going to ship a clean Wonder Woman game. It's going to be, we're going to stick to our core strengths. We're going to do Wonder Woman with Nemesis system stuff, and it's going to work, and we're going to get out of there in like 3 years. And then 4 years later, the game wasn't very good. And Warner Brothers was like, come on. So they kind of shuffled the leadership. They rebooted the game to a certain extent. What can happen when you have 150 people working on a game for 4 years is a lot of things get built and then thrown out, and nothing gets finished. So the game never looks great, but it uh, you can very easily in a big studio get into a state where nothing is good enough because these games are so big. If you're working on a small game, especially like a weekend game jam or something, you have like a core idea and you can build it right away and you're like, this is working or this is not. And a really bad state that people get into in a big studio is, well, this idea is going to take an animator and a VFX person and a sound person and all these teams that you have to schedule time on and roll it together. So everything is partially done and nothing is done well enough. Everybody's super scared of building these new and different things, and nothing is great. And you're just kind of like, well, we know we're going to put production in and it'll work eventually. But it never congealed, and it's because they weren't actually in the virtuous cycle of building stories that were working on players and building off of that. So they kind of 2024 they restart that Wonder Woman game. 2025 in January they can the head of WB Games, and then a month later there's a new head of WB Games, and the first move they do is kill 3 other studios, including Monolith. This is kind of why in it like a big company, you people are afraid of turnover, and it's not because there's necessarily a threat. They're not, the new person might not necessarily be a threat to your specific project, but when a new person comes in, they tend to do a phase of cleanup. They tend to go, if they have a plan for something new, they're going to sweep some other stuff away. So that's when projects tend to get canned. Stuff gets moved over. Well, so there were a couple weeks where they're closing Monolith, so I went back to the studio and I kind of hung out with them, which was pretty interesting. Like there were closets that were being unloaded that just had archives going back 20, 30 years. So somebody carried out a box, and they're doing this in a mode of, Well, we know that this is all property of Warner Brothers, and most of it should be destroyed, but it will be lost forever if if we don't bring this out. So there's like a box of press clippings from the 90s. There was a box of game pitches that were rejected. And it's like there's weird little judgment calls being made there about if anybody's going to get in trouble if these things aren't destroyed. Um, and whether anything is ever going to see the light of day because this stuff is going to go like everybody's assumption is that it was like the end of Raiders of the Lost Ark. It was going to go into a vault. They're like, don't worry, we're going to archive it, but it will never be seen again. So I'll see. When I was there, I was talking to some of the people I didn't know. Like I knew a bunch of people, but there were a bunch of new people, and a lot of what they had done to build Wonder Woman was hire new people. The studio looked really different. It's a lot more diverse, which was really nice. That was actually a big problem with the old studio. It was very easy to see why. The old studio kind of hired for fit, and fit to them meant like, oh, it's somebody that we could hang out with. Like there were a lot of card game clubs, there were a lot of family-like things at Monolith, but that also had led them to we had 15 people named Matt in the studio, and we had two Matt Allens. So they were kind of getting past that, and there were a lot of new people, and I was talking to them about like what they were going to do, talking to them about interviews. Somebody asked me like they had an interview at Fail Better, like a narrative studio, and they were talking about, oh, what do you think I should do for this design test? And so I said, well, one of the things that you should take in context is that they know that you worked at Monolith. They know that Monolith is famous for the Nemesis system. So they're probably going to want to know about that. So you probably want to think about whether you want to put that right in your design test or like make sure to bring it up in an interview or any questions like that. Like that's part of why they're considering you. And so he said, this is actually important. Tell me what the Nemesis system is. If they're going to ask you, you tell me what it is. And that was worrying because this was a great designer. This was a smart person. But what they told me is that the Nemesis system is it's a system that takes player actions and it uses them to create a story and characters that feed off them and then kind of dynamically feed back into the system. And that's wrong. And it's wrong because it doesn't help you build it and it doesn't help you build something that's interesting to players. That's a description that comes from the designer's point of view. Like it kind of makes sense as you're thinking about it. But if that's all you're thinking about, you're not going to build interesting stuff and you're not going to build stuff that works. And it wasn't just them. It was kind of the story that I'd heard over the past few years from talking to people who are still there. It was a story of, well, we're going to focus the missions on this thing. We're going to do this, and that will be the Nemesis system. Like they had actually confused themselves because they had this name, but they didn't have the core definition and they didn't know what they were moving it to. And that was it was honestly a shame because there's a lot of cool stuff in here. Um, it was also the Nemesis system is, of course, a patent. This was a weird news blip that we had. A lot of you guys have probably heard of this. There, this was a misstep. So this is like a thing not to do. What happened is partway through the development of the sequel, Shadow of War, the publisher said, "Hey, you guys, should we use this as a back of the box phrase? We use it as a marketing phrase. We told everybody it was the Nemesis system. Like we have this keyworded phrase. You should do a patent. It will be cool." I think a lot of you guys are engineers, right? Like usually engineers in software companies, like patents are fairly common in that. I think it's a lot more common at big places like Microsoft, Amazon. It's not very common in game studios. Um, I think a lot of it for software is like that stuff tends to get white papered, put into like SIGGRAPH talks, put into GDC talks. And it's really uncommon for design stuff. Design design tends to be there's not a lot of boundaries. Like we get a lot of clone games. There were legal cases back in the early 90s about some clones, like some Street Fighter clones that Capcom did, that were ruled against Capcom. So people basically haven't touched this. And so when we did this, it was kind of new and it was novel and kind of scary, which is perfect for a news story. Like it's novel and scary and weird. Like, oh, that's an interesting story. So it didn't get us any prestige, which is what they had hoped they would be getting, and it just got us bad press. And it also didn't, it never got used or threatened against anybody. It's actually something that's just sat in a drawer. Um, the Nemesis system is alone, and what I mean by that is literally nobody is doing this. This is a quote by Mike Bithell. He's a small developer. He's kind of grown his studio over the past 10 years. He did Thomas Was Alone, a bunch of cool stuff since then, like the new Tron game. Um, but he was saying like, oh, it's repeatable. There's no reason an indie game couldn't do this on a text level. There's going to be a ton of clones of it because you just name characters from a pool. You pick events through randomization. It's easy, right? People will be doing it. He's not entirely wrong in identifying things that are going on, and a lot of the core of it is really simple. But this is really close to the thing that I was hearing from people at Monolith like last month. It's close to that wrong answer where he's focusing on the process of the designer. He's kind of making guesses at how it might work, but he's not thinking about the player in this answer, and he's not describing like what's important about it. I don't. So why are there no clones of this today? Like I don't. There are a couple games that have said they're doing something like this. There was that XCOM 2 expansion, War of the Chosen, where they said like we're gonna have bosses that are gonna come back, and they got some of it. Like they did have bosses that came back, but it wasn't doing this sort of thing. Um, and I think it in general, the problem is that you have to design a lot of your game around it, and there's a lot more than just the bosses come back that people need. There's another reason that, well, okay, so there was also a thing where when there are versions of Shadow of Mordor that don't have the Nemesis system because they were ported to the Xbox 360, and these games were designed for the PS4 or Xbox One, which has 8 gigs of memory. The 360 has 512 megabytes, and this was an open world game that didn't have streaming in it, so it meant that the whole level is in memory. All the characters are in memory because the characters can ambush you at any time. So that totally didn't work. And so they just shipped a really generic like Assassin's Creed like game, which is really sad. So the first thing that the Nemesis system does is make a promise to the player. Like the player has to have an understanding. If we're talking about this and we're telling them what it's going to be, we need like bite-sized points that they're going to understand. So there's procedural bosses. They're going to remember you. They're going to hate you, and you're going to hate them. They're going to grow, and they're going to change, and this is all going to feel like really personal. You're gonna care about this a lot more than other games. Um, I'm kind of curious. What do you guys? How would you describe the Nemesis system?
Mm. It's
Oh,
more like it's just more feels like more personal connections with these random.
okay. So what do personal connections mean?
It feels like they respond a bit more to you because of your actions.
Okay. What does responding to you do in that sense? Do you think?
It makes you feel more situated in the world, right? Like your actions have consequences.
Yeah, like it's reactive to you.
Yeah, like you exist in the world and the world exists even with or without you too, right? Especially
Sure,
that
sure,
progression in the background of the different like leaders, right?
sure,
Well,
sure.
It may offer more replayability, like you can change uh, a series of actions, see what you can test and what the
That
limits may be.
yeah, that was interesting because like we never built it. We kind of built it on that and kind of not because we're an open world game. So we have a lot of repeated actions inside of that, like templated repeated missions. So it's repeatable in that sense, but it's still got the beginning and the end of the game. So that's kind of, yeah, that's not really, I wouldn't say that's a mechanic. That's maybe an outcome, like a dynamic that arises because of that. Anyone else? Yeah.
It's less like you're creating like a nemesis to the character in the game and like a personal nemesis of your own. You
Yeah.
have a personal grudge against them.
Yeah.
They get it.
It does weird things with your perception of who you are in the game. Like, there are a bunch of ways that a game can approach how distant the player is from the character. Camera view is a huge one. If you're right inside of the character's eyes and you don't see their body as much, you assume that you are the character. If the character doesn't talk very much, that also puts you a lot more like our main character talks sometimes, but not very much. So we have like this much. And then you'll notice a lot of times too, like if the character can do things that deliberately distance them from the player. If they say something that uh, upsets players, like it can drive a huge wedge, and that's usually something that will upset your player, but it can also make them like get shocked and realize it. But yeah, there was very much that for us that kind of went. We always framed it as how does this affect the player, and not how does this affect the character. Like our stories were about the player; they weren't about our character Talion. Anything else about the Nemesis system? So this is actually, are we going to get sound? Okay, so, cool. This is kind of how marketing sold the game. So in this case, they need to sell it in under a minute. Oh, no. Oops. So like they're hitting on the stuff that they're kind of trying to pinch. Oh, wow, this widget is not responsive. Well, the stuff that they were hitting when they're pitching on it was like the tags above all the enemies' heads. Like, what's one detail that they remember you by? Um, and then they went to that, no, nothing will be forgotten. Like, what marketing will do is kind of, they're not always, they want to find a statement that's not wholly true, but true enough so that when players are excited, and when they come to your game, they're not disappointed. If you, a huge part, and I think we might talk about this tomorrow, but a huge part of the experience of a game or any like piece of media is setting the expectations before it starts. So what marketing wants to do is somebody goes from this to the game and they go, okay, I was prepared for this. I'm getting what I thought I was getting. This was also hitting the allies beat, which is something I'm going to kind of get into later. It was after we did the first iteration, it was a way to kind of build out the system. And it kind of goes in steps for how we could build it out more in the future. One thing that the Nemesis system very much is a procedural generation system. So um, I've kind of mostly worked on games that have procedural generation. Like one of my first games was a space anime roguelike called Galaxy. Um, the Nemesis system had a ton of systemic generated content. It's built off of that. I'm kind of working on a Zelda-like game with generated enemies right now. It's like I said before, it is really interesting as a designer. It's a huge problem space that you're working on. There's a ton of unexplored stuff. There's so many things that nobody has ever done with systems that build out the game for you. So it's very easy to do something and feel like it's cutting edge and be generating experiences that maybe somebody has never seen before. And it also, when you're working on a game, especially when you're working on a big game and it's going to take years to finish, a procedural game will make new stuff every day. And that is so cool. It's so much better than doing a level where you know exactly what's going to happen, you know what all the outcomes are. But that's kind of the big trap because you have to be really careful and ask yourself when you're building these, are you building it for yourself or the player? Um, and it's so close to an engineering problem. It really is intimately about building and like algorithms that are going to generate this that you can get caught in the engineering of it. This is going to make it better. This is going to let me analyze it more without spending enough time asking, what does the player see? What are they going to need? This relates back to what I heard, at Monolith. Like, if you're not talking about the player, you're not actually solving the real problem. So let's talk about procedural generation. What do you guys think of as procedural generation? Like, what would fall into it?
Like
Yeah,
world generation.
yeah. World generation is a huge part of it. It's honestly one of the hardest parts of it. What else? What other? Because it's like you can kind of break this down by system in terms of this stuff.
You
Uh,
do enemies as well.
what's that?
You could do enemies as well.
Yeah, yeah.
Stats as well as visuals and stuff
Well,
like that.
and like in Shadow games, we had static levels. We could not afford like our lighting was baked. We can't afford to change that, but we could afford to change like the characters. I think that's kind of an unusual way to do it, which is part of why it popped. But yeah, you can totally do it that way. There's even smaller ones. There's smaller and like really big ones that people are starting to dig into too. Like um, think about think about something like Diablo. Like what kind of stuff gets generated in Diablo?
Loot.
Loot. Yeah, that's like and this comes right away. Like in the earliest games of generating loot, and it can be really simple or it can be really complex. But it's one of the easiest things to like put together.
Isn't that
Yeah.
like one of Borderlands' big selling points
Yeah.
back early at Borderlands?
Right. And like okay, you compare Borderlands to Diablo. How is Borderlands different than Diablo? Like, because the pitch of Borderlands is very simple. It's Diablo as a shooter. Great, I got it. But what do you actually need to do to make that fun and good?
Have visceral differences between your items.
Yes. By visceral, can you unpack that?
They have to feel different to use,
Yeah,
right? You don't want just 300 different guns that do slightly more impact, slightly faster reload,
yeah,
slightly different damage, right?
yeah. Because what happens if there's an even spread of like shot speed between your guns? Like, does it mean anything? Do you remember how they solved that?
I know they introduced a billion different elements,
Mm-hmm.
and they also introduced a bunch of different brands that all had a unique gimmick on each brand.
Yeah. What did the brand do?
Depending on the brand, it really changed. Some of them had explosive ammo, I think. Some had more likely to be elements. One of them, you throw your gun after to reload it and
That was
explodes, and
funny.
it's
Yeah.
my favorite.
That didn't make much sense.
It's funny as hell.
Yeah. Um, I think the brand was super important because it gave them, and it also had a mesh with it. The
Yeah,
brand
visual
had the
identity.
weapon model, but it also gave them a core identity that could be tuned by a designer. So like you have a spread of shotguns, and you have 7 core shotgun models in Borderlands, and then each one is going to be run and tuned on its own, and then you apply the mods on top of it. And that's actually super important for procedural generation is having and it's a two-way street. It's having something that makes that is good and serves as an anchoring point that you're kind of building off of. And it's also identifying things toward to the player so that they can anchor on it. That they can say, I know what this brand is. I have a general expectation of what it's going to do. One of the hard things in Borderlands is when you get a weapon, understanding what's going to be different about it from your other weapons. Like what they end up doing is the player goes, oh, this is different because its stats are different. And they've put all this work into how it might feel that players can already make a judgment and throw it out before they've done that. So that's really tough too. What kind of problems is procedural generation good at solving?
Quantity of content?
Yeah, kind of. Okay, here's what I want to say. Yes, but less than you would think. So because, and what we're going to talk about is that it doesn't really make new content. It puts it in new contexts and it combines it in different ways. And so that spreads it better than other ways, but it's not actually going to make new content. So if you make five biomes that have certain rules, the player will learn and master those rules and then kind of be done with it. Like it doesn't go on indefinitely. Other things that it does. If you're working on a procedural game, well, actually, I want to talk about this from the player side. From the player side, what else is good about procedural generation in games? Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So like you can tell a story about or something like that. Yeah, that it's interesting how that works. Like you need anchoring points that people are going to share. So like, can you think of a lot of good stories that Diablo gave you or something like that? I don't think that's, but when you have something like Fallout or Skyrim, those are not procedurally generated. They are just massive so that players out of different stuff have a similar feel because they're so big, but they're better at generating stories. And that's because players have shared like commonalities that make the stories make more sense. Um, we the Shadow games were really good at doing stories because they had enough shared language that stuff all made sense to people. Other things that are good from a player's perspective about procedural generation. One thing that I really like is challenge. Like I think as a player, I come into a lot of procedural situations feeling like the game will be able to be meaner to me. Like uh, the game doesn't care about me as much in a way that a lot of really designed content will. It'll never let me get too unsafe in a way. And I do appreciate that, and I think that's an important thing that you can message to players. That's why it can be important to tell them when there's a safety rail and when there's not. Sometimes it depends on what you're doing. If you are trying to build cinematic moments, then you need to do a lot more of the Disney smoke and mirrors. Kind of, it's more of a theme park. But like the Souls games, the Elden Ring are so big because people trust the game and they feel like their experience is valid compared to other players because they had to do that. Even though there's tons of ways to break those games, you can play it in much easier and much harder ways uh, without that. One thing that happened, and it took us a long time to get past, is that we had a lot of what I would call naive procedural generation. So the game on the top left, does anybody know what this game is? Yeah, it would be almost impossible to this one's Rogue. Um, but yeah, like early 80s, I think Rogue was mini computers. It wasn't really a terminal thing. I guess they were out of like building games for university mainframes at that point. But uh yeah, all it has to generate for like the level design are square, well, rectangle rooms and corridors linking them together. Um, and it needs to generate like a critical path. I think when its algorithm when it's generating these picks a start and an end point, and then generates a bunch of rooms and makes sure that there's connection points between the two. That kind of carried on for a really long time. So, does anybody know what this game is right here? Does it look like an explode? Yeah. Yeah. Oh, it's so good. It's so cool. So this is, I mean, this is like 92, 93 or something. It's one of the studios that works on Dragon Quest games a lot of the time. And it's similar sprite work, yeah. And like this is the main character. He's a guy with like a big Japanese like rice hat. These are enemies on a grid, and you can see the mini map up there. And actually, the mini map looks almost the same as Rogue because it's really playing in the same space, playing in the same rules. They're just using graphics to kind of make it a little bit more legible. Anybody know what this one is? This one's actually brand new. Well, reasonably new, and also really old at the same time. Yeah. What's that? Nope. Um, not quite. Yeah. Yeah, that's the new Steam version of Dwarf Fortress. And like Dwarf Fortress is doing a lot more than these games are doing, but it's well, this is probably a player generated room, but it spends all that time building a world, and it's building. How does Dwarf Fortress actually do the world building? Is my question. Yeah.
Sort of simulates its constraints for the right generation.
Mhm.
It sort of simulates actual geological.
Yeah, it totally does. What is weird about that? Okay, well, can you think of anything? Here's what I want to ask. Why did they do it, and what is it doing for the game?
Is it increasing building deadlift?
Of your hole in the mountain, right? Like, I think it matters, and it matters because of what Dwarf Fortress is, but it's not really about generating playable user space. It's about building something that people who make it think that is cool. And then Dwarf Fortress is doing enough of those things, like in a Tolkien style, this is my life's work and I'm a weird obsessive, and this isn't actually rational behavior. But when somebody else looks at it, they go, wow, that's amazing. I want to participate in this. So, I mean, if you can do that, yeah, go ahead. I actually, uh, these guys had an earlier game, uh, a 3D game that I saw them talk about. And they were like, this is like in 2003 that they were working on. And they're like, yeah, we have a character and we generate like landscapes that you can run around on. And we model all of your organs. And so spells can affect it. So you can cast teleport on your spleen. That's kind of the end of his story because he was like, well, he did it. And he's like, well, that project got stuck and we stopped working on it after a while. So we moved on to this game because we didn't know what to do with it. Uh, and I think they got a lot more out of like building Sims like characters, and that is really cool. Um, but I think from this style, there are a lot of limitations as like a player experience. Um, can anyone tell me what you can't really do with this type of like level generation, or like why it kind of got stuck there for 30 years?
It's hard to script like big moments, big dramatic climaxes, like ongoing story and stuff.
It's totally hard to script. I think what these games do, like the sharing games, will go to a locked room when they need something like that, which feels kind of weird. I think there are more problems though than just that. Yeah, go for it.
Decent.
Yeah, totally. Like, what does this actually do? This does have meaning. What does this mean in terms of level design? You've got this really tall room. You've got exit on the bottom, left and right down here, and then one, and then two exits on the top. You got a room up, a smaller room with four exits, and then a really small room with four exits. Like, this has level design meaning. Uh, what is it? Like, how is this, which is I think this is where the camera is, I believe, in the bottom of this room. How is that shaping the player's experience right now? Um, I don't think so. I don't think it's I don't think it's doing like a communication. Like in 3D level design, you're building it and you're placing markers. Like I mean, and one of the things is that 3D is much bigger than 2D. Uh, so you have to do a lot more signaling, like no, go over here. They're obviously not doing that in this case. That is definitely a limitation. I don't think that's what, like as a player, you're like, I know how to play this game. What does it mean when you walk into a room like this instead of like one of these really small rooms? Yeah,
Mystery Dungeon being said, I always feel like I'm more vulnerable.
totally, totally. Like these follow a lot of the rules of classic shooter design, where the player's kind of capturing ground that's safe and trying to not get attacked from behind. So uh, I think in this game, and I think in most of them, you can get attacked from all 8 spaces around you. So you really need to not have 8 spaces around you. Tunnels become incredibly important. So anytime you can choke point, you're only fighting one guy at a time. Super great. Um, and anytime you're in a big room, guys can. This is a turn-based game. You take an action, all enemies take an action. Most enemies take like one movement, but then they start doing like this enemy might move 3 in a turn, or some enemies take 2 attacks per turn. So it gets really scary. But that is definitely something that the level can communicate, and that's going to be different on these other rooms. Like these smaller rooms are not going to be as dangerous. You have at the same time, when you look at the exits are super important for level design as well. What do the exits do in terms of a room? Like, what's the difference between a room with one exit, like it's a dead end, or a room that has 4 exits to it? Like, what can happen to you in one of those rooms?
It's got like four branches. There's more enemies that come into those groups, so it can force them to.
Totally, totally. It does. It's a danger thing. Like if it's a dead end, like once you see what's in the room, that's what you get. It's also super important in exploration. Like what is your process when you're going through this? What are you trying to do as a player? Totally. Like you want to get enough treasure so that you're strong enough. Uh, so what kind of algorithm as a player do you have for exploring these rooms?
Follow the way wall, check a route, keep looping like you're.
Yeah, totally works. Totally works. I mean, one benefit I think of having this mini map is that you'll see where things are, and so you don't need to follow a simple algorithm like that all the time. Thorough. Well, and I know, and there's that game in normal level design of, I mean, I'm totally this type of player where you look at where you think they're pointing you, so you're like, well, clearly I can't go that way. I need to check for secrets first. It's and that's what is that? That is a phenomenon that is a dynamic that arises because players have learned what you're teaching them, but they're not doing what you think they'll do. Like what you think you're doing is telling them where to go, and they're getting that information, but you've built another game system, which is I like to hide secrets in corners, that is causing them to shift their behavior. And maybe that's fine. And I think a lot of people approach it as like, well, I enjoy this, so that's good. I don't know if we necessarily know something better, but it's an interaction that was not necessarily anticipated from when people first built these things. So yeah, we can get all those things. Um, in terms of these, like the combat systems are all pretty similar. None of these are all the modern roguelike, like action roguelikes, wouldn't work on a game like this. And that level design is a huge reason why. Like, think about what a platformer needs for level design. And this just isn't going to work. And the reason why it's not going to work, and the reason why people weren't like making progress, is that they were trying to solve it through engineering and through better algorithms. Like, and this gets really, I mean, these are pretty simple algorithms, but this gets really complex really fast. I think the most complex forms are like the dwarf fortress ones, where you're taking in geologic rules and you're kind of building those, and that is really cool. And there are a lot of like SimCity, a lot of the SimCity games have a very similar algorithm where they can generate random maps for you. Civ games will do this, and those have rules about like water flow patterns and mountains and kind of the dispersion of those. They use different random noise generators to kind of get the right descent on mountains. So like Perlin noise will give you a certain pattern. And that also all that stuff kind of goes back as well to old computer graphics research. So like if you trace this stuff back far enough, there's papers in the early 80s where they're figuring out uh, algorithms to generate stuff because they can't encode the data, they can't model the data by hand at that point. So they can render it at like 1 frame every 10 hours. And in order to do that, they need to describe it algorithmically rather than by creating content and saving the content. But it just, those goals, which are very cool, those are goals oriented towards presenting like a plausible world. They're not player-oriented goals. They're not designer goals. So they're not, except for very specific types of games, they're not getting us to where we want to be to make procedurally generated levels. So this is Spelunky. This is actually probably the pre-commercial version of Spelunky. Spelunky was, how many of you guys know what Spelunky is? Cool. For anyone that doesn't know, I kind of consider it the first roguelike platformer. Like the first game that said, I can make infinite Mario levels and actually did a good job. And it did it by cutting out most of the algorithm of it. It's dirt simple. Uh, so the way that this graph is drawn, you see these boxes here? Each of these boxes is a chunk of level design that's getting selected from a palette and placed into the level. So what that means is these are built by hand. So this is like the key insight. Rather than trying to do everything with an algorithm, do your design and then put it together. So building procedurally generated stuff is a design process as well as like an engineering process. So you need to know your interactions. So I think in this case, I think the way that it works is uh, this is Derek Yu's game. He puts all these rooms in, and then he picks the first room and the end room, and he knows that the end room is going to be one of the bottom rooms, and he knows that the first room is going to be on the top, and so those are a special palette. So he's got like a palette of ending rooms and a palette of beginning rooms, and he's just going to put one there, and then he's going to test if he can get a clean path from the start to the end. You can use like a lot of games with more organic shapes will use something like A star to kind of figure that out. I think in this case, he's already, you don't even need to be that complex. You can do it by marking it up and reading your own markup. So these Spelunky rooms have in their palette, they note where their exits and entrances are. So he can just know, uh, if I need to get from this floor to this floor, one of these needs to have an exit on the south side. And so you can just pick from rooms that are tagged with exit on the south side. And in the same way, I need to have a room that has an entrance on the top side. And then there's something else really smart that made it a lot easier to ship this. Uh, you can kind of see it in, I don't know if you can see it in this picture. Yeah, you can see it right here. This is like a tiny room that's closed off. But this is totally valid in Spelunky. Do you guys know why a closed off room would be valid even if he's trying to solve? Like his rules are, I need to be able to get from start to finish cleanly, but it's okay to have hidden rooms that are totally sealed. Do you know why that is? Yes. Why is that not okay though? Why does he still need to keep this open?
He don't love this.
Yeah, exactly. So it's consumable, but uh, it makes the design a lot more forgiving. So situations that would be bad, and you'll see it in Spelunky too, where like really unfair stuff happens. There's like a pit of spikes and there's 5 guys throwing spears. But you can also throw a bomb and get out of it. So what I would call that, like, that is a different system, that it acts as a pressure release valve on the generation. So if the generation screws you, well, you have this other system that can get you out, which is really smart. There's also, after generating this level map, it goes in and then it adds other game systems to it. So it adds treasure to this. It adds traps. It adds enemies. So it takes these base pieces and it adds them on. And again, they don't need to be super complicated in the way that they're placed. You can have markup where it says these are spots where it's okay to add treasure. These are spots where it's okay to place enemies. All that stuff. If you build as a piece of content a room that is a bunch of spikes, you can put your spawn points for enemies like not there. And you're like, okay, it'll work. That makes it so much easier to do than trying to build an algorithm that will make all of that make sense. Just like anything else, that means that what you're doing when you are placing these things and selecting them is design. Uh, so this is the story curve. Um, it just when we were here in November, we kind of talked about how this is applicable to almost anything, because almost anything follows this pattern of rising action with a climax and then a fall, kind of reset. And in the context of a long thing, you're going to be rising and then you're going to fall, and that means that this is uh, the macro scale mirrors the micro scale. So you can apply the concept of rising action, climax, fall to uh, uh, in a single enemy encounter. You can apply it to a long-term thing. You can apply it to like a level. What do you want to be most exciting about a level? You can apply it to a campaign and how that campaign should feel. How does this apply to procedural generation? What do you guys think? Yeah, totally, totally. So how would you, so if we want to apply this to selecting objects, how would you apply that?
Spawn is oldest in the color. You have like you're like a key found on your regenerated the color, so it's sort of like one there. So like have that number for example like difficulties.
Okay.
You have the first layer 0 to 1, you have the plus again.
So the story curve is 2D though. Well, wait, what do I want to say? The story curve is one directional. How would you apply that to like a grid space? Yeah, totally. I think that makes a lot of sense. I think that you can do, wow, this is great. This is a marker. So this is what whiteboards do. Oh, is this your personal stash? Dude.
Yeah, tier new things.
Yeah. So if you have start and you have end, uh, and you've got this is like a graph. If you treat it like a graph, um, of nodes and edges, then you can totally think of them as a numbered series of the number is the connections towards the end. So this is like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And we have our curve, and we can split it and sample it. And we can say, okay, if these are the sections, then a sample at 1 will look here, a sample at 2, a sample at 3, and so forth. And we can use that to throw in noise. Like this can get scaled up or down to meet like whatever level the player's at. What about, say there are side rooms. What would you do there?
These sauces is actually because of one of the rooms in before.
Okay, I think it's valid. Kind of.
Could put that as much.
I have a certain requirement to enter that side room.
Oh, like you could do there's a key in here, and then there's like a lock right here. There's a game that did that. I can't remember what it's called. They made two of them, and they talked about that. And it was cool. The game they built was not very good, unfortunately.
Or you could say, so you get to room 5,
Uh-huh.
you find an item there,
Yeah.
and you miss the
Okay.
button. There is an item up, but it's not mandatory. And it's more of a completionist. Something that you something that would love to have, but it's not very important.
How would you get the algorithm to do that?
Sorry?
How would you encode that into the algorithm?
Great.
I don't think it's that difficult, honestly. I think sequential things, this is a little bit trickier. I think the thing that you're talking about, we could solve it with lookup tables. So we've got a specific table to look up.
So, like you would connect to a spreadsheet.
Yeah.
Oh,
Well, think about this. These are rooms on a table. This is a palette of rooms. So there's some tool that's like, hey, build a new room, and you build it and you add it to that. Is that really any different than a table of like items that would fit? Because these are also tagged with like, this is an appropriate room that you can go down in, you know. This is an appropriate start room. This is an appropriate end room. Yeah. You kind of have to think of it in that way. So if you wanted to plug in a main item and a side item, how would you so if we know where you're getting the data from, how do you decide where to put them?
I was thinking like games like Raid Up, where where it sends you all over the level, so you can explore every companion.
Okay. So like in as a player experience kind of enforcing that?
Where there's like yeah, where you what where you are kind of forced to buy a progress bar,
Okay.
or kind of it shows you how much you've actually completed that
Sure. Sure.
that patch.
Sure. That was super common in like American platformers in like the early 90s. The ones that had the ones that had levels that were like this, and like they had paths that looked like these are like this would be what like core paths, like the Aladdin, the Genesis Aladdin game or stuff like that. I hate these games. I hate the style of platform. It's like a Mario level looks like this, right?
Very straightforward.
Yeah, because they have they want to know what you're doing and they want to control the pacing and kind of the sequencing of that. And these are, I believe that the American like platformers of that time were kind of descended from more adventure games, like like dungeon adventure games, and they kind of thought of them more from that top-down perspective. Uh, and they would go to get out, you need to collect 80% of the gooblies to get out. So like people moved away from uh and they moved away from that I think because in a platformer, unlike a dungeon game, there's not enough direct player conflict to to feel like you're losing resources at that rate, like you're testing yourself in encounters. It's a platformer. You have this baseline level of competence, and you're looking at specific encounters. Um, and this becomes very loose. Like a lot of the stuff that the player does in a game like this, it doesn't feel as tightly designed. It's like a Mario game.
That it's like the platformer is kind of static, like it's not like moving around like around the player.
Um,
If the environment is the direction of the player, it's like
I don't think there's a ton of environment interaction back in those days. Like like you think so do you know why Sonic was really interesting at that time?
really fast.
That was a big part. There's a huge thing that they did in the level design that was brand new. Yeah, that was big. And so like if a Mario level looks like this, a Sonic level kind of looks like this, and it's actually got generally 3 tracks to it. Um, their super key flashy feature was really good slopes. Like you think about Mario 1 or Super Mario Brothers, it's all blocks. And then Mario 3, they add 45-degree slopes. And you know how you can sit down and you can slide down them and you're like, wow, that's really cool. And then Sonic, yeah, it's got the loops, it's got full half pipe ramps. And the character looks good running up it and all the physics work. And like that was super cool. And I guess you could say like the casino zones in those games were, with all the springs and stuff, were very dynamic, but I don't think there was a ton of like dynamism in the levels themselves or reactivity per se. And a lot of that is also to do with the architecture of the system because the systems they build the world out of tiles, so the tiles can't really change very easily. They have to go to main memory to kind of grab a new tile. It's all very slow. Uh, but yeah, kind of getting back to it, if you think about the player experience of what you're talking about, like, what if you had to collect enough items? What does that look like for the player? And can we make it better? So for the player, I go through the dungeon, and I get to the end and it says you need to collect more items. What do I know at that point? Say if I've done this. Like I guess I know what exits I would.
Skill of the players. Hypothetically, the Duke's going to be the one to like increase sort of mechanics. Could you scale it off with player last hit? So say the player hit 6, you're like, okay, the next major, no matter what it is, that's 7 now.
Yeah.
Modify quick movement.
You can. I don't think many games do that. And I think there are a couple of reasons for that. I think it's very similar to dynamic difficulty problems that we have. Like, uh, it's very hard to keep the player from learning that eventually. And once they learn that, their concept of the world changes radically. It doesn't feel like a solid world. It feels like, oh, I can tank, and my situation will change.
Side path of
Yeah, super valid. I like if similar because I think one of the first things we said is you can set it at the same place. So if it was like that's a 3, that's a 5, that's a 6, you could also kick off an arc so you could treat this as like 4 and then 5 like that.
get your full action if they just back.
Yep, you can totally do that. Um,
Or it would be possible since you're getting E, where it would be a 5, it could be going. That's our boss room, you're gaining
mhm,
progress. That would do like the rising action
yeah.
to then reach a falling action to get through.
Now this is super important. Would you again? How would you put that boss there with the key? Like what is the part of your algorithm that tells you to put a boss there?
I mean, you have to like there.
And player communication. Those are like the two halves that we need to solve. So like my challenge to you with the do you need to collect enough items is like how are you communicating with the player? And that's kind of where this is where like conventions like keys and locks help a lot. If you think about what's that?
Stuff where you're like,
Mhm.
what stuff?
Yeah. And what they're doing two things at the same time. They have how they have Metroids have doors, like energy doors. And there's like here's a red door, here's a green door, here's a yellow door, here's a purple door. once you've opened one, you're like, oh, I need to find the right item. And they also have a ton of powers that don't open doors, but they do other stuff. Like you can phase through walls of this type. You can bomb through this stuff. And what they're doing is they're mixing your expectations of what you're going to progress with surprising moments, so that it's not all it's a lot more interesting to suddenly realize that you can go over here and there's a new room because of the that you have. And with like keys and locks, the key saying to the player store's locked, you need to explore more to find the key is a lot more appealing as a player experience than you need to collect more items, because it's directing them towards a singular goal that makes sense. Or if it was you need to kill the mini boss or something like that, like Binding of Isaac, it's trying to build Zelda dungeons, and they always built keys and locks. I'm like,
When you do that, does it help if you put that lock close enough that the direction that thing goes like fresh in memory? Right? It's not like, oh, well, I can figure out where that door was.
hmm. Well, let's talk about the player experience. First off, how big is it? Like this map that I drew is pretty small. You're not going to have that much of a problem. If we're talking about Spelunky, say this right here is locked. Uh, and say we put the key here. So like I think the critical path is here, and then down, and then across, and then down, and then across again. So if we put the key here, what is the difference in player experience between the key being here and the key being here?
You've seen this key before, hypothetically?
Visibility can be really important. In a lot of ways, there's not, if this is all fog of war, the player's not, you have to think about what the player's making the decision on. And again, that's where like symbols can be really useful. You're telling the player, you're giving the player more of a directed goal than something very vague. Um, if you want them to find an item, and I think that is a valid goal, it's not wrong to say you need to explore this level. It's just we can't solve all of our problems like that. Um, I specifically, in terms of like finding the key, I don't think, I think if you are very clear about what you're doing and your levels are below a certain size, I don't think it's a big deal, personally. Um, if you are doing like procedural Doom levels that take 40 minutes to beat, I think it probably matters a lot in that case. But Spelunky levels are like 10 minutes to beat. So I don't think it's a big deal there. Um, was there anything else in this? I don't know if I have anything else to talk about this, but the really important thing I want to say is that what we are doing is we're taking design tools and we're trying to codify what we know to be a good experience, like what works about a Mario level, put it into a form that is instructions. We're not trying to solve uh, something to make this elegant. We're trying to do the thing that reuses as much design stuff as we can and matches what our design like goals are. And I think that's super important. Uh, there's some other stuff. Oh, this is also something used for spawning systems as well. Works really well for that. So Left 4 Dead, uh, the Skaven Left 4 Dead. What is that game called?
Ah, which one?
Oh, it's not Dark Tide. It's the earlier Fat Shark game. Vermintide. Yeah. Yeah. Anything that does that is relying on this. They have like a baseline level of guys and rooms, and they have a preset level that has bosses at certain points, but that's correlating with this. And this is importantly, your start position is a little bit randomized and the intensity is a little bit randomized. So you get like it hits at different moments and things can cross at different points. And so this is like the Left 4 Dead and Vermintide thing is it's kind of a frequency problem where if you think of it as doing this sort of thing, but you are starting waves of different scaling at different points, you're going to get interesting crossovers. this can just be really hard to control. So I think in order for this to work, like if this is representing our boss spawns, like the ogres or like the bosses in Left 4 Dead, and this is like our horde line. So you're gonna hit like a big horde here, but maybe you're gonna hit the boss right after you hit the horde. These are like in Left 4 Dead, it's kind of time based. It's not really like ground covered based.
Urban Time makes it worse when you stream it.
From the Twitch chat. Those are fun. Um, yeah, and like that, I think can be uh, really interesting. They need like a game around it that can remain engaging even if you're at a lull and stuff like that. Um, so I think a lot of you guys saw the mechanics, dynamics, aesthetic lens. I think I should go over it again, but this is a lens. When I talk about design tools, they're tools that don't solve anything. Anytime we're like, this is how you think of it. This is how players think. None of those can be total and all encompassing. They all have holes. So they're more, I treat them more as tools to think about a game, to like simplify it and apply it later. So mechanics, dynamics, aesthetics. Does anybody know how that works? Yeah, go for it.
Well, I just went through talking in this section. Yeah, it's
Sweet.
you look at it one way from where the player looks
Mhm. Yep.
through dynamics,
Yep.
and then you look at it from the designer
Yep.
building mechanics and trying to understand the team's aesthetic experience.
Totally. Totally. What are what are the mechanics exactly?
Cars, game systems, and
Mhm. Totally. Like they're the rules that you code in, and also yeah, the rules that the game rules that you've built. What about dynamic? I think dynamics are kind of the weirdest one.
how the ways that the player interacts with the game systems.
Mhm. Part of it, yeah. Um, I think honestly, I think the terminology is influenced by cybernetics, like cybernetics, which the word doesn't mean. I have a hard time associating the word with what it means, but cybernetics, which is more of a 50s or 60s thing, was like studying organizations and how they built processes to give themselves feedback and then grew off of that feedback, and how other like even mechanical systems would work that way. I like to think of dynamics as a feedback system. So it's like the player's actions against the mechanics turning into the dynamics. It's when we're building like levels and putting hints to people about where they should go and them knowing that there's secrets there, there's a dynamic that's kind of grown up as a result of that. That wasn't a rule that was encoded. That was something that is a natural like result of those things. So when we are designing, like say, a procedural generated system, where's the best place to start with this? Uh, how would you map the gameplay loop to the mechanics, dynamics, aesthetics?
Sort of like if I choose an example like Gungeon where like the game moves spawn at the start of the level and then explore enemies and then gather more equipment and
Mhm.
those force.
Okay, so if we say that's the gameplay loop, um, I would say those are kind of the rules that the player has to do. So kind of taking what the rules are for the game. Um, I think I think we can do. I think that is risky because I think that can be hard to separate from our like desires to build the game and our inspirations from other games and find stuff that like players want. I actually think it's really important to start with the player side of this, and I think it's logical to start with the rule side of it. Like I think that's our normal tendency. But what I want to say is the reason that nobody's been able to do the Nemesis system stuff is because they're not starting with the player side. And furthermore, I think what's weird about this is that the most important designer who designed it is a really weird guy. So I think the most important thing for this and what made it memorable is that its entire design principle was about what the player experienced. It was all focused on player aesthetics, and everything was kind of backfilled from there. So when this was being developed, we looked at what actions the game was doing. Like, we're an action adventure game. We know it's going to be a Lord of the Rings game. You're going to be killing orcs, and you're going to be kind of going through Mordor. Uh, it wasn't going to. We weren't going to design a system that was telling the game what to do. This was totally looking at the game and building the most engaging thing. And so when looking at the game, we looked at the interactions that people were having with the orcs, with the villains. Uh, what interactions can you have with an orc?
The first one?
Yeah. What can you do? You're developing a Lord of the Rings game with orcs. You can kill them. I think that's pretty good. We're pretty confident that we can make that fun on its own. Like, we think we can do that. What else can happen?
Second,
Yeah. Does that? Here's what I think. That's an awesome answer, which is why we did it. But I don't think we got there first because it's a weird answer. Like, I don't think we started with that uh, because I don't. That's not a story that's existed in like Lord of the Rings stuff before. Yeah, super important. Because uh, that is an experience that you can feel. Like, you care about that. What else do you care about with these guys?
Mhm.
Totally. You care about like that's kind of a driving factor to get you to kill them. That is an extrinsic motivation, is what I would say. So what I mean by that is there's a game reward that's awaiting for you at the end of it. And it's not getting loot is not driven by the like your inherent desire as a player for what you want for this character. It's driven by your desire to get past them to get the thing that they drop. So for this, I think we have to treat stuff like loot as less useful than more direct things that tap into your emotional state. Yeah,
Do you think instead of
we can totally do that. I think this is actually really similar to the loot thing. So like we're talking about a game, and we go, what happens to you if you lose? And that's a conversation. Like, do you lose time? Do you lose experience? Do you lose like world state? Do characters get stronger? So I think those are also extrinsic motivations that we can build on, and because of that, we can also take them away. Like, the nice thing is that we can say, this is too much, and we can turn some of those off or on.
what game do you
Uh, 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 uh. I have. Let me remind me to talk about Swordbreaker. Is that? It is funny. It's actually awesome. Um, yeah. So when you have I think honestly what we found the most important ones were killing them and being killed by them. Those are important experiences. And when we had those, what are the emotions of that experience that you're getting? Go for it.
depends on say how much we're challenging.
Okay.
You're basically not going to heal him. So it's difficulty by feel satisfying. If it was one of those one that you had to run in play and come back later, you're going to, you know, what's the word? Uh, it's going to feel cathartic.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Sure. Frustrating. What frustrating? What are other feelings when you lose to them?
Anger.
Anger. I think anger's good. What does anger make you want from them? Yeah. Like revenge. So that was kind of where we were, and we're like, well, revenge is a loop because you can take revenge on a guy and then he can take revenge on you, and so we can build a game off of that. So this is very good for our game, and this is very good in a video game sense because it's something that already exists in the game. Like super important in this, when we're designing this layer of procedural content, we're not we're not trying to add on a new game loop that exists outside of it. We're trying to enhance something that is that is like our core competency. So it's not going to feel extraneous. Yeah.
After beating the vessel,
Mhm.
back, like, are they able to still again come back stronger?
Yeah. So that's super important and that has weird implications. Uh, but it's also cool. I'll talk about that one later. Um, the other thing about like this topic, this like revenge loop, is that you don't need to you don't need language or game rule abstractions to explain it to people. Because this is something that they're already kind of having, we can we can demonstrate the system through more natural human things like characters talking to you, characters doing things that you will understand. That and they're not doing game things; they're doing like actions that make sense, like I kill you.
Is that like text box have been muted anywhere? The big title button and makes it
So that is a specific problem, which is when you meet them, do you know who they are? And do you know what's changed about them? Like what we basically need to do, this is a really hard problem, and I think I talk about it later, is we need to write a scene entrance for a character when they need to show up. And they need to show up in a lot of places. So it's weird. So there's also how does the player express this revenge? Like if this is something that we're going to have our characters do, can the player participate in it? Uh, they totally can, and that's going to lead us to build more systems into the game. Um, okay, so we're going to need some game systems to hook into to build into this. So, what are the game systems, or what game systems would you propose to inspire this like revenge cycle? Because a lot of these are things that already exist in the game, and what we're talking about are a lot of labeling, a lot of calling out, a lot of flourishes, and then we're also going to add some of those extrinsic motivations to them to kind of make them stronger. You know,
track, out, clear away to, track, out of existence, I guess you could say, and it's well,
huge, huge. That becomes enormous, and it's a big part of it because like you give them names, uh, you give them those introductions, and then you're like you get into and this is a virtuous cycle of asking how can they be more different? How can they be more interesting? And then you're putting your energy into making them more interesting, which makes them more interesting to generate these stories off of. What else? What else can trigger these things? Like we're talking about in open world action games like Assassin's Creed, you're fighting bosses, and you want to feel a cycle of revenge off of them. And what we need are specific game interactions, like things that already exist in our worlds.
capture this moment so that when you go to the port,
Clearly. So how could we put a character in that and make that an interesting revenge cycle?
a boss of the thing that's been like punished as a self failure,
Okay, so the boss has been punished as a result of failure. How so?
it was a height.
Hmm.
You can always check the higher. I was like,
Hmm.
but it,
There's a time system. Um, what is your what? So if you feel, I guess what I want to dig into is if you feel like a character's been punished, what is the story if they're now the boss? Like where are you in relation to them? You fight them and you humiliate them. They go down here, right? So if you then see them and they're up here, what does that story feel like?
it's like stuff's going on back up. The world's alive.
That's true. It does imply that. You know, Yeah, I'd say it could do that. Um, yeah, I'd say that's plausible. That kind of gets into our cheating death loop, like where they come back and they're stronger. More commonly though, and we get more juice if it's a guy that killed you then becomes the boss. Because like if you compare those two stories, the guy who you've already proven you're stronger than is now stronger than you. That's a disconnected story, and the player has to fill in those gaps. Like the player has to kind of invent that story of they came back stronger. A guy who killed you and already proved that they were stronger than you is now the boss. Like that derives more directly, and so because there's less work, there's less of a distance for the player to go. It tells more of a consistent story. Um,
Cycle of revenge. They would
yeah,
also have to do something. There would have to be something that happened to the player before anything else, right?
yeah. Has something happened to the player? Can you elaborate on that?
So yeah, so like uh, the player would have to be looking for revenge or just would either have had to do something
Hmm.
that's rolled or these characters,
Okay.
the organization.
Okay.
Uh, so if they were to be looking for revenge on the player.
From like a high level sense, there's the narrative sense that can feed this. So there's a whole like the narrative intro because it's very edgelordy is like, oh, the orcs attacked your fort and they killed your whole family and then they killed you and now you're undead and you want revenge. And that does inform it. Mhm. You're an undead zombie guy and you also have a ghost in your body. It's very long. But that is like that's coming in. And that's I think what that is an example of the narrative, knowing what the having this core identity of the game be so strong that the narrative is also working in the same direction. And that is really important to make. Like it was in the first game, it was a very simple narrative, and it wasn't super fleshed out, but it was all pushing in the same direction, so it was at least very strongly felt. Mechanical. There's flourishes we can do. So, say an orc kills you. Um, that's an engaging moment. But we can make that more interesting. We can let you have a last chance to cheat death because it takes that story space and then fills it out and it gives you a different outcome potentially. That outcome is a little bit different. Yeah. But in this case, we're promising that we can do story stuff based on that with these characters. Like you said, we can cheat death. So we can take the experience of killing an orc, and then we can say, well, then they come back and they're mad about it.
Stat line that says how likely they were to cheat it.
Yes,
They almost felt like there was one guy who was like
yes,
killed 7 times and
100%,
stay down.
100%. I'll tell you how it works later. They can also ambush you. So this is kind of weird, and this is kind of a problem, but we want these guys who hate you and have stories with you to interact with you, and normally we assume that the player starts all interactions. Like that's how games work. So this is specifically saying you're going to be walking somewhere and somebody will tackle you, force a cutscene on you, and then start a fight with you. Uh,
Sometimes they would call each other.
yep, they're fighting each other, which is cool. That that is important. That's important for the friendship concept. It's less important for the revenge concept, but there is a story in there. Do you know that story? What is the revenge story if you have an orc that you hate and another orc that you don't care about, and they're fighting each other? Yeah, what happens if the orc that you don't know about kills the one that you hate?
Feel off.
Yeah, you totally do. Guess what? You hate that new guy. But also, and really important, we can't pull that card very much because that you do feel robbed, which is also why the guy who you hate is more likely to win that fight. Totally more likely to win that fight. Um, And then the big thing that we had to build is this taunt sequence, so that when they start a fight with you, when you will hit a cutscene that is forced on the player, which is tough. Taking control away from the player, especially when they don't anticipate it, really jarring. Uh, Not great. So you have to have an extremely good reason to do it. And we made the problem worse in the second game because we had more characters that had more cool things to say, and that gave us worse like interruptions to the player's behavior. So they taunt. Um, and this is super important. Sometimes so we could this is a virtuous cycle. Sometimes we had them taunt by not doing anything and they had a hype man. And the hype man did all the taunting. That was pretty good. Sometimes the guy couldn't talk and he would just kind of groan at you, which is pretty good. But what is an orc when an orc shows up and they tell you you're a loser, and I'm way stronger than you, and I'm totally gonna kill you. Exactly. um, it's setting up what we're doing in that point is setting up our story. Like this is going to be a story that will get resolved because at the end of fight, somebody will die or run away, and that's going to prove what this guy said, either right or wrong, and that matters. This is terrible. This is terrible for the reasons I was talking about with like player agency and players' expectations. It's horrifying for the world and the concept of building cutscenes. So if you think about what this means in a big 3D world where you've got like rivers and valleys and slopes and stuff, what this says is the player can be walking anywhere they want. And we have to run a cutscene where the camera will move from them to look at this other character who will be standing in a plausible place, and it will have to frame them. And the camera, the camera it's basically a cone, but the camera can't back into a wall. That would be bad. The camera can't be pushed to an odd angle. Normally, what we do is for the player camera when they're running around the world, we we kind of have two choices. We either collide it with stuff, and we usually do this with like big world geometry. So the camera is, you push it near a wall, it's going to pull in because it doesn't want to clip through the wall. Because if it clips through the wall, although you're going to see the backsides of polygons, which normally aren't drawn, so that's okay. You'll see a bunch of like shell stuff. You'll see the edges of shells. And it looks ugly. Um, and you kind of just need to decide on a rule for that. So for us, we're like, we're never going to let the camera clip through a wall. Sometimes the system breaks. A guy ambushes you. He's too close to a wall, and the camera's like looking through your crotch, and it's terrible. And what this meant in like our scale is that we had to have 6 people like working on these cutscenes, and they were giving alternate requirements for like what the world needed to be built like. So they would say, if you guys build any slopes that are more than 30 degrees, we will die. We will just flat out die. Because if you're staying at the bottom of the hill and they're up there, but we want to frame them like this. When they're designing these cutscenes, they design them with tracking markers on these guys. They need to have a system that can, it's generally like they model it with a dummy character, playing their animations with the camera in a certain spot, and then they give bounds for how the camera can move. So if it's too much, if the slope is too high, their framing is going to be totally broken. And this means that we have to spend a lot of time coordinating with them. And coordination is what makes AAA games so expensive and hard to build, because any change that somebody makes can impact, it's a web. So it's an exponential growth because your changes will impact way more people's work. Uh, if they're doing these taunts, the most, and it's interrupting the player, we have to know, we have to make a judgment on whether it's interesting for the player, like whether it is going to be annoying to them. Uh, so how do we encode those rules for what is annoying? Like what is the most annoying thing that could happen to you to get interrupted when?
find something wrong with it?
I mean, something that's terrible. We had a strict rule. You can't run, you can't interrupt the player when they're climbing. Totally true. Anything else?
So,
Yep. The animations, any of those like player animations were totally locked off. So we would wait. Um, it could trigger right after, which was not good, but it was not the worst thing that could happen.
I mean, like you wouldn't get to finish, just turns on the
No, it would finish and the camera would be returning to gameplay angle. And when it hit because that animation is tagged, when it hit that point, it would then, yeah, and then all the camera things are, all camera animations are blends. So you're crossfading in the influence. You have a camera transform that wants to do one thing, and you have a new transform, and you're going from 0 to 100% of like your new camera, basically. Yeah. Yes. Totally. And this is something that got worse in the second game when we wanted to have bigger fights. And so this what this means is that's it's like a limited situation. Is it cool if you're fighting one guy and then another guy comes in halfway and now it's much worse? And we're like, yeah, that's cool. Um, but is it cool if you're fighting one guy and you feel like you're doing well and it plays that scene and now you're disoriented and you take a hit and that feels cheap? Like, no, that's not cool. So this is like the problem with these procedural systems is that they have all these edge cases that are really gross and you need to identify them and you need to be really considerate of whether the cost and the player experience is worth what you're doing.
So in this game,
Hmm.
when you these guys would just be on the map, and
Mhm.
if you walk close, it would just automatically trigger the cutscene.
No, well, okay, there's two ways to do it. So when you fight a guy and it's doing this will generally pop after you've hit them with your sword once or twice. So they're already right there, and it's less invasive to then pull in, they say their line of dialogue, and then it pulls out. And because they're pulling out, they're going to reset into a combat state that's neutral, and you're at an okay distance, and you're okay with fighting. So we consider that pretty safe. It gets annoying if it does happen too often, so we wouldn't pop it on every guy. The ambushes are when you're doing something like walking around or fighting, and somebody tackles you from behind. So we literally spawn a guy where anywhere that the camera can't see them, and then they play the animation. Bam. And like there are stories that tells that you can't tell without doing it, but it's also really obnoxious. So you would just have to be really, really careful to do it in a way that feels good. Yeah. So this is kind of the broad map of the interactions that trigger in it and kind of the loops that they generate. Generally, you start here when you meet a guy. You meet a captain. He's an orc captain. So he's probably got a name, and he introduces himself. And so there's only a couple outcomes. The player can run away. Okay. The player can get killed by the orc. This leads to a couple things. Sometimes the orc decides not to kill you. They just laugh at you and let you go. And then they like despawn. Uh, that's an emotion right there. Like in a lot of ways, that's worse than getting killed by the orc. Because they usually their lines are like, "You're not even worth killing." Really. You can die, and if you die, we can do a flourish on that where we make the orc stronger. And they say, "You're such a loser. I killed you. I'm stronger than you." And then they get stronger, which is really nasty, but it increases your challenge. And so there's a cycle that can get really scary in there where you can get killed by the same guy so many times that he gets way stronger than you. Um, that the reason we let it do that is that it was worth how strong that emotion is because it starts adding fear into that. Yeah, normally there is. So our expectation is that if this happens, some of the players like we wanted to balance it so that he wouldn't get so strong that you couldn't beat him, but some players are like they didn't feel confident or they just weren't at a skill level where they could beat him. because what you can do is play the rest of the game and then come back to that guy. Or we give you a ton of mechanics to make an unfair fight, so you can take on that guy. And then there's a mode in the sequel where the cap is taken off, like the hardest difficulty takes off that cap. And what that does is it kind of gives the game a fail condition. So you know that you can kind of perma lose your save file. So it kind of adds to that tension in a way that deliberately has to be kind of cordoned off from the normal player population. So you have to do a lot of signaling, like this is deliberately unfair. Do this if you want a crazy experience. All of these outcomes where you lose can lead back into hunting the captain, which is usually a player choice. It's usually the player's like, I want to go get that guy. We give them tools to find them. This is where the hierarchy comes in. And so the player can engage in finding that guy again and engaging them and talking again. And that also means that we have an obligation to, when you meet them and they say something, to have them say something that comments on the fact that you had this engagement before. So you have to write content to that. On the other side of it, if you're winning, the orc can escape, which is funny. There are guys that are just cowards and they run away. So that creates this interesting, like, I wish I could kill you. I want to get your loot, or this is pathetic. I feel pathos towards you, which is kind of an interesting feeling that plays into the befriending mechanic to a certain extent as well. You can, when you are going to kill them, they can play a card that says, nope. They can just say, no, you can't kill me right now. So this is actually really similar to humiliation. You expected an outcome and you earned that outcome. Like in this case, you did lose, or in this case, you did win. And then there's a game, the card just flips over and he says, no, you can't kill me. That was worth it to us because if we don't do it too often, it makes you really mad. And making you really mad is okay to a certain extent. Once you have defeated them, this is where these extra cycles come in, because we're looking at defeat, and normally defeat just means they're dead and you get their stuff. Like that's where we started at, and that's where a normal game was. And so then and this is why mapping it out was a helpful design tool, because you can go, well, if this is such an important moment, what will feed into this revenge emotion that we want? What will make it stronger? So let's have more outcomes. Let's have them run away. That actually makes you want revenge even more. Let's have them cheat death. Cheating death is crazy, but what it does is it balances this a little bit. So in a normal game where guys stay dead, you only get to meet them a second time if you lose, and then they come back. That just doesn't happen enough. So we just had to bend the rules and say, well, their orcs are going to come back, and that will be interesting. And you won't care. There's a little bit of player experience where you're really frustrated that they come back because you did kill them, and you do deserve for them to be dead. But again, that's the cost. But the trade-off is that we get to tell longer stories. So stories would be so much shorter if they never came back. The other nice thing is that you get their loot when they die. So even when they cheat death, you've actually already gotten the reward. That's actually really important to not make it too nasty. Shame and Recruit are the really different ones that got added. Recruit is the first one. Recruit is make them your ally. That's a really different outcome to the story. And because of the game it was, because it was this Lord of the Rings game, and because it was so focused on revenge, we didn't build Recruit as a buddy story. For the most part, Recruit is they're your slave. Like it's kind of this, it's very much, basically the narrative conceit is that the ghost in you brainwashes them using powers very similar to like the One Ring to force their weak minds onto your side. So they are forced to be your ally. And there are a lot of stories from that lead off of this where they betray you, where they lead a rebellion and stuff like that, because that feeds back into the revenge cycle, which is what we're actually hitting in these games. Shame is where you've defeated them in battle and you decide not to kill them, it's the player side of humiliation. And so you brand them on their face so they have like a scar on their face. What it does is it lowers their level to get weaker in power, but they get returned back to the world. And because of our systems, they get returned back into the world and you're more likely to meet them again and they're going to be really upset about it. So this is a way to engage in revenge. This is the player getting revenge. So it's working on our core aesthetic there. But it's an interesting variation on that story, and it tells an important thing with our narrative, which is the you are the bad guy side of it. So the kind of the final thing I want to say about this is a lot of this stuff was already there. This is like without some of these nodes on the bottom, this is kind of what the game already was, and we're adding these Nemesis revenge loops onto pieces that already existed, and then it's inspiring us to add more game mechanics to further these loops. Um, okay, so we add the branding and the allies. That inspires new types of missions. You can rescue them. They'll get captured, and you can express something nice towards your new slave allies. Um, you can go on missions where they're fighting somebody in the world, and you can jump in and as the unkillable zombie guy, win the fight for them, and they get stronger. Um, and that also gets us our it gets us our betrayal, it gets us our brand. Those are the extra interactions that we get off of that. So the branding thing is really interesting. This is kind of what it is like for the player experience. Um, so this is a Lord of the Rings game. Uh, and you guys know the like story values of Lord of the Rings. Lord of the Rings is a story about the Ring of Gyges, like the old philosophical device of if one person had ultimate power, could they not be evil? And Lord of the Rings is like, no, they obviously would be evil. That's what the whole story is about. So our imagery is all about uh, using those powers. Uh, I think this was good and bad for the games, but it importantly was an interaction. Like I think it was worth it and interesting because it was interacting with those core thematic elements. I think in the first game, and this is like, we're selling you a power fantasy, like a game that wants to sell millions of copies. We're kind of getting away from this, but it tends to fall into these very like generic categories of emotions. Like it's about power, it's about coolness and stuff like that. Um, and in the first game, it's only half the story, so it builds in the motivation for the revenge, and it shows you getting strong, and then it stops with you defeating your main enemy. So at that point in the story, it's like, wow, this seems great, uh, which is really it's kind of terrible as a Lord of the Rings story. So then when we build the second game and we finish it, it's kind of a story of doom. And what we do is we layer on like every other character relationship is about foretelling impending doom and kind of building through that. Uh, what happens when you have sold your first game like this, and when your imagery that you're selling to the players is still like about how cool it is, and really importantly, when the players are playing as this main character, we're building an anti-hero story. So we're building a story where at the end the character falls. They at the end of this game he kills one of the ring wraiths and he becomes a ring wraith, and um, that is a point where we broke with our players. Like a ton of our players didn't understand that and didn't believe in it. And so what it really was when I was talking about what are your player expectations coming in, we're setting specific player expectations of being this cool ranger who's going to kill all the orcs, and that character's story motivation is I want to save Mordor. I want to get rid of these orc captains. And the story says, okay, if you do that, you will be evil and it will make the situation worse. And when we say that, that doesn't feel true to what the player experienced. It wasn't the story that our game loops were great at telling. And so because of that, it was rejected by a lot of our players. So I think that's kind of a lesson about, like, my takeaways from that are that when you are building these specific aesthetics that the player is going to realize, and you've done a really good job of like mapping them to your gameplay loops, you have built a box within which your story can exist that players will accept. And if you go outside that box, a lot of them are just going to reject it and they're not actually getting the story. So that's kind of a problem for any game that wants to do Nemesis type stories. And it became a huge problem when we were building the follow-up game, when we were building Wonder Woman. When we were building Wonder Woman, we had to decide, like, what does it mean? Can we have revenge? Does Wonder Woman want revenge? And does the system work without that? Oh, stop that. Okay. So we also have like the marketing team. And again, they're doing a very similar thing where they're trying to communicate it in like 30 seconds.
Shadow, nothing will be forgotten.
So what that's different than what the game is. Right? Like what I was just telling you guys about was how recruiting allies isn't really recruiting allies, it's recruiting slaves. And how that those stories turn into betrayals. Like the end of the game is about how this was never sustainable. But at the same time, I think this was fine and effective at marketing because the game mechanics, like this is actually kind of truthful to the game because the game mechanics were creating those stories for the player. And so this is a case where we have this overarching narrative theme where we're like, it's really cool to recruit a guy and have him save your life. Like that feels great. Uh, but we don't want the story to be like, it's cool to enslave a guy and say like, you're my best friend now, right? Like, but that's not a story that our systems can tell. So this is I think a story of the limitations of what your game systems can actually do. This is the orc hierarchy screen. So this is your interaction set with those characters. So what we realized is that once we have all those loops, like all these loops right here, we need more ways. This is a loop where the player meets them in battle and fights them. So we could make this more interesting by giving the player an insight into things that they do and generating more orcs. So to do procedural generation, we need to do generation. So we need to add more characters. Because what's going to happen is we're filtering these characters out. They're going to get removed from the board. A lot of them will cheat death, but when they get removed, that's also an opportunity to add a new character. We're going to do things like if the player can recruit them, that sets up a state where, well, can the player recruit all the guys? And is that interesting? And that's not really interesting because it freezes the world. If everybody's your friend, then there's no conflict. So we have to have rebellions where some of them will just break out of control. That reinforces that overarching story, but that also injects more gameplay, more characters into this. That also means that we need the system of time. So every time time doesn't move in real time, but every time you finish a mission, every time you teleport, every time you die, it advances a turn. And these guys start missions against each other. Like a character will start a mission of, I'm going to fight this other character, and that will end with one of us dying. And finally, and really important, this is a tool for the player to initiate their own missions and kind of direct their own gameplay. So it lets the player pick a character and then choose what mission they want to create. And these characters they all have an assigned spot where they are in the world. They're not really there in the world, but they will be there if you go there. And that has a specific mission associated with it. So it can be, oh, this guy is brewing potions, and you can interrupt him, or this guy is trying to tame a grog, And if you go there, he'll be fighting a monster, so he'll be weaker and easier to fight. That's a little bit of an easy situation. This is also an interface to let the player pick a guy, tell him, I want you to fight this guy, and then pick another guy and tell him, I want you to fight this guy, and pick a guy and say, I want you to fight this guy. So it's an interface to let you gang up on a character, make it completely unfair. Um, this is weird. Stepping back, like in a big game like this, it's a big Assassin's Creed-like game. This looks like a strategy game. So one of our biggest challenges with this is how do you teach players about this? How do you get them to engage with it? Is this actually an activity that people want to do? And how are we making the decision about whether this is good? Like, this is the decision about new game loops that the players can engage in and ways that they can expose the pieces. And what we ended up having to do is make it non-required. It's not required to finish the game, but it is a way to play the game mostly against these Nemesis characters. Okay, so that is actually kind of, these loops are the player side of it. The other half of it is how we actually generate the content. So that part of it is the actual mechanical side. And what's really important is that as we've kind of solved all of the player side of this, so now we just need to make the right decisions when we are building the mechanical side. The most important decision that we made is that we only wanted to do interesting content. So this is, there's just, I just fundamentally, we don't need to cover the full gamut of everything that can happen in here for every character, because that means when we have a specific character, maybe there are 3 stories that are really awesome with them, and there are 5 that they're capable of doing but are not that interesting. We need a way to not spend time on the boring ones and put our work into the interesting ones. This is really similar to Hades. Hades is kind of solving the same problem, but for a narrative game. So, do you guys know what's interesting about what Hades is doing as a roguelike? Yeah. hmm
Vice versa.
That only lasts for one round, right? Like it resets every time you die. I It might change in the second one. I haven't really played the second one. In the first one, I think they have a persistent like, which is kind of how often you've interacted with them. I don't think they have a persistent dislike. Like I think they have that dislike in the specific round where they can spawn the I hate you challenge. Um, but like specifically, I think Hades solves something for the narrative for a roguelike. And they were able to, I think a problem with a lot of roguelikes is you can feel like you're not making progress because the game very clearly is like, there's a skill check. You need to do this well, and then you will make progress, else you're going to go back to the beginning. A lot of games are, if you fail, well, you'll still be at the same place. Or if you fail, there are other ways to get more powerful and finish it. These does do that because they want people to finish it. But really importantly, you get narrative progress whether you succeed or fail. Because every time you die, there are characters in the palace who will talk to you. And those are story threads that will keep going. And what's super, super important is that those are really simple story threads. Like for each of the Hades characters, for the most part, it's just a straight chain of dialogues they can give you. And what matters is that it's strung out over time. So this is treated as a reward. And sometimes they put like a lock on them and it'll say, this character won't have anything to say until you've met this other condition. Like if once you've gotten this far in another character's conversation or met this other character or something like that. But for the most part, this made their dialogue does not interact with other dialogues, almost as a rule. There are very few cases where it does. That makes it way, way, way cheaper. But the player experience doesn't feel like it's limited because the player only talks to them every once in a while. Like when they die, maybe that character's there, they get one interaction with them. That's enough of an experience to feel like you have a relationship with these characters while being much cheaper and much more interesting. And if there are situations that they want to call out, like, oh, it was really interesting how you died so early on, they don't need to write that for every single character. They can only write that, they can write that for one character. The player still gets that experience of having a reaction to it, but they've only had to write one of them rather than like 12 of this statement. So that's kind of what we did. We call the system that tracks how much an orc is useful for your story the player interest score. And this is what drives our selection process. So when we were selecting guys to show up in a mission, we pick the guy who the players interacted with more than other guys. There's a bit of randomness in there, but for the most part, it's really as simple as that. Uh, we just we when we are generating missions out in the world, they're casting. A mission will say, this is a character that wants to start a I'm dueling another character mission. Or sorry, it starts from the event. The event says, let's generate a two characters fight each other mission. And in order to do so, it needs two characters that have enough player interest score. And if it finds those, it will put them together. And then the player will see that as characters they already know doing that. For the more elaborate ones, they had higher thresholds. So you would only start to see those stories once you knew the characters better. And it really is that simple. I think a big part of this is like, you actually don't need to overcomplicate your algorithms. Doing the simplest, dumbest thing is super viable and going to be a lot easier to test. The other thing that we need to solve as a part of this is how do we put our orcs together? So this is like a problem of using our content in an effective way. It's the same problem as the Hades dialogue. We need to get out of what our artists can produce and what our budget is the most. This is really important. We don't need to get the most orcs. We need to get the most interesting orcs out of it. So what we get on a character, and this is a decision that we can make, we have to decide what parts we can swap. So we end up with, we can swap their head, their shoulders, their left arm and their right arm. Separating the arms is really useful because they can be asymmetric. It lets you do like asymmetric fashion and stuff. And then we can kind of switch their lower half. We also separate their equipment, so their helmet, their pauldrons, their chest piece, their waist piece, and their weapons. The weapons don't change. Most characters can use most weapons. The equipment does change because these are skinned 3D models. You need to remodel them for each like body. So it becomes really important how many basic bodies we have. When we start, this is so what we need to make a decision on at this point is like, how are we organizing them? This is a decision driven by a different game system. This is driven by combat. So we have the base combat roles that the characters can be. Then this is like, oh, there's a warrior, he's got a sword. There's an archer, he's got a bow. There's a scout, he throws javelins and he like runs up and back and forth. This is actually the weakest of the designs because it's really hard to say like, what's the difference between a scout and an archer? It's not clear to the player. There's a defender, he has a shield, he's really annoying. And there's a savage who is like a berserker, he attacks really fast. And then when we make the sequel, we add Ologs, which are giant guys. They have a little bit different rules. Because this is so important, because this is a gameplay decision, this gets priority, and this gets to be like, this is the way we are, and so nobody else can change this. We're not going to change this for the Nemesis system to get more stuff out of. So this is really useful because we can say, okay, this is a good starting point. We're going to have these guys, and they're all going to look different. What can we do? Well, we can give them tribes. Tribes, so these guys can wear different clothes. So there are 7 tribes, and that's how we're going to design our equipment sets for them. So this was a choice between, you can have the artists go with, we have the budget for it, and we need like 24 generic like sets of armor. Like make a bunch of different ones. But putting an organization scheme on them makes it make sense to the player. And it also puts rules on like how they can go together. And so it kind of directs our art budget. They go into advanced classes, which is a way to kind of modulate where they're at. So from a specific base class, they pick up an additional class on top of that. There's some restrictions like uh, the archers can become assassins, they can become marksmen, but only archers can become marksmen. So it also, this is kind of like one of those gameplay multiplications where you can get, in terms of what the commander does, he gives you the ability to summon guys and he gives you buffs for nearby allies. A defender commander who's got the shield makes for a really tough commander. All his guys are going to have shields. An archer commander who's already really weak and easy to kill is going to get archers, and if he's in a good spot, that's good for him, but he can go down really easily. So that's interesting from a gameplay perspective. It's not as interesting from like a nemesis system perspective, but it's a useful way to kind of matrix them. Super important to get scars. So when they cheat death and when they come back, they have a changed appearance. This is really important for the revenge stories because it's they don't just say something different, they look different. And so when we can prove that, and part of the reason that we're enabled to do this is because A, we're gory, and B, we're kind of comic booky. Like it's not super realistic. So it gives us these very direct consequences. And this is also really important when you think about the player's memory. If the player kills a guy and that guy shows up an hour later, how much do you know the player remembers them? And how much do you know that they remember like what exactly they look like before? So being really loud about it is really important. And it also makes their emotion a lot more understandable. Like a lot of times when they come back like this, they say, "You did this to me." And they're understandably very upset. The story where the guy shows up and he keeps on cheating death turns into one of our unique orcs where he kind of and it kind of this is how the design process can work in something like this, where the procedural system can generate a guy who cheats death again and again and again. What that can do for the designers is go, well, that's a cool story. What if there's a guy who cheated death so much that he turned into the Terminator? Yeah, sure. So what became really important about that is that when we're looking at this budget, we reserve a certain chunk of it. What we've done so far is we've like took a bunch of our orc models and our gear and put them towards like, okay, well, they're going to need to be spread against the base classes. So we've got 6 of them. So 100 divided by 6, 100 sets of gear divided by 6. And then we're further going to divide that between like all the tribes. But then when we have these stories, we say, well, we need to set aside a chunk of our art to do this because this is awesome. So once he does that, um, he doesn't really play like the other guys. And when you look at him, when you look at the shape of his body and his face, uh, that body actually only matches this guy and this guy. So like these are skinny guys. This guy has like a heavier body and these guys are gigantic. So if we were to put this guy together and say, you need to spend art time building him like this, we have to make a choice. Like, does this mean that we need to build a version of this for the skinny guys, for the medium guys, for the big guys, and for the giant guys? And the super important answer that we said, and this is the like, you don't need to build all of your content, is no, because he's unique. And we are going to choose to pop it only when it's a good story, and we're going to hide it from the players when it doesn't pop. So we called them unique orcs, where they're like, this is a level uh, of unique model that actually doesn't play well with the procedurally layered stuff. Like it doesn't play well with different armor. It might not play well with the different body types, but it's worth doing. So what we're going to do is we're going to make it work with only a certain type of character. And then the story that generates the guy who's covered in spider webs because he died from spiders can only happen to a guy who already looks like this. And if a guy who looks like an Olag dies to spiders, he's just not going to have that story happen. So this only works in a game that you hide the cards from the player. If the player had control, if we did one of two things, if we said when this happens, it's guaranteed to happen to this character, that wouldn't work because you could cause it to happen and you'd expect a result. We have to keep it random so the player knows that it's a chance of happening, but it doesn't always happen. And we can't let the player control the system. Like if the player was the one who was like, I want to do this to the orc. That wouldn't work. Dude, you have brought food. Um, there's another there's another thing in here where they're called unique. We should put out this food, actually. You're looking for like okay. We should do pizza, totally. I have about half an hour left of stuff to go through. Like I think I was like I can do this until we'll do this until 9, and then I think Evan was like 3 tomorrow.
I'll get all this. No. Sort of. Green promise. No, leave it all there. Great. Your sense of yeah. Not sure to
Even more tables.
yeah. Not enough space. Yeah. I want serve but it's like
So where you want to check out while you're here?
Um, anywhere I want to check out. I like in Kamloops.
Yeah. Or just generally in the interior?
So it's about a 4.5 hour drive, I think. It's not terrible. I'm heading back on Sunday. I probably have work on Sunday night, which is annoying. Um,
Like work or like
yeah,
Kickstarter work?
well,
I guess that's work.
it is. That one doesn't pay me, so
Yeah. Like work that pays the bills or
yeah.
yeah.
Um, I don't. So okay, I need to decide if I went to Ustad G76.
What's that?
So it's like in the old downtown. It's an Indian restaurant.
Cool.
But the name of it is the name of the guy who founded it, and the entire place is wallpapered in pictures of him. The tables have pictures of him.
Oh, weird. Okay.
It's amazing. And there's like a banner above it that
Yeah.
has pictures of people talking about how awesome he is.
That's funny. That's super funny. This guy's so awesome.
It literally one says Ustad G is awesome.
Honestly, fair.
And like one wall has like it's a vinyl wrap is what they did. They're photos of him like put onto a wall size thing, so they're super pixelated.
Yeah.
And then they printed it as a like 10-foot wide, 8-foot tall vinyl wrap.
Okay.
It's insane.
That's awesome. It's good. Man. I can't the balls of that guy.
Uh-huh. Yeah,
It's so confident.
I
You
know.
just like make a restaurant and post pictures of awesome.
I would highly recommend it. It is quite an experience.
Aggressive feedback.
Yeah.
grab your point. Oh no. Oh my god.
Wait, what? Oh, I don't know.
Wow. You want some pizza? Please. Mm-hmm.
Okay, even though there's only like 15 people, one of these. Fair order,
Nice.
there's. And then yeah, I got the doctor. Red Bulls are there, and then there's also a small amount of sodas.
Bringing more stuff.
Oh, we're gonna.
I get more water.
Five right sticks, 5